But I've had feedback since then from people just saying, Phil, that was the single worst thing that happened to the startup ecosystem, because for a while there, people had the assumption that should be the norm. That's the norm. You can make tens of millions of dollars return in a year, and investors were looking at it through that lens. And when big companies were looking at setting up startup studios, they were saying, hey, a year's happened. Like, why hasn't this spun out yet? So there were some bad things that happened because of it. But I think the combination of having Dean's energy and commitment and conviction with the Pollenizer engine, if you like, that was underneath it at the time was good to have both of those things at that time in history.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 149 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have the venture partner of Main Sequence Ventures, Phil Mall, as my guest for this episode. Phil started his career as a theatre director before taking those skills and applying them into tech, initially as the CTO of file-sharing company Kazaa, before going on to co-found the first incubator in Asia-Pacific, Pollenizer. He is now a partner at CSRO's venture capital fund, Main Sequence Ventures, which has $490 million in funds under management to invest in Australian deep tech and science-based startups solving the world's biggest problems. In this interview, we covered a wide range of topics, including why 50-50 equity splits between co-founders is usually a bad signal to investors, the importance of taking leaps and having a high velocity of learning, the art of learning, the importance of finding the right balance between soft skills and venture science, and much more. Without further ado, here's my interview with Phil Mall. Hi Phil, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
It is awesome to be here, Rohit. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, I've waited for this interview for a long time, so great to finally get you on the show. But Phil, for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Oh gosh, where to begin? I think the important stuff is that I am a company builder. That's what I consider to be my role on this planet. And my journey to get here began remarkably as a theatre director. And I won't dwell on that too much, other than to say that to be good at being a theatre director, you need to be good at pulling a group of people together, motivating them with something other than money, focusing them on making something awesome out of thin air with very little resources. And I did that for more than 10 years in the UK and here in Australia. And it kind of taught me everything I need to know about the instinct of working with people and making hard things with very few resources. I made money during that period making websites for people, because obviously it doesn't pay well being in theatre. There came a point at the end of the 90s when we'll all remember that the internet went a little bit crazy. Things started going off. Netscape started making whole new opportunity spaces available for people. And I realized that I needed to get on the train and not be half on the theatre train and half on the web train. And I made the leap into being a web developer professionally. And at the time I thought, I'll do this job for money, and then I'll have a sabbatical every year, and I'll make some theatre and recharge my juices. And what I realized pretty quickly is that actually I enjoyed doing the web work just as much, because I was actually doing the thing that I enjoy doing, which is pulling teams together and making something out of thin air. And so I was still in my comfort zone and really enjoying it. And so I went deeper into that. And one of the main customers that I worked on at the sort of height of that period was Kazaa, which was one of the big post-Napster file sharing companies that at its height of us working on that here in Australia, it had 35 million people using it. It was 85% of internet traffic at the time, because remember, this is the days before, this is how you could share video back then, for example. And I got my first taste of being in a startup at scale. And when that all finished, after we'd been sued by all the record companies and all the movie studios and had a very intense period of time, we wanted to join another startup, and that's me and Mick Lubinskas, because we met each other at Kazaa. Mick was the director of marketing at Kazaa, and I was the chief technology officer. And so we looked around for startups to join, and there weren't any at that time. So we had to make some. And so Mick and I decided we would create Pollenizer to help startups to form. And that was in 2008. And between 2008 and over that 10-year period that we ran Pollenizer, we helped literally hundreds of companies come together. I describe it as something of a booster rocket for the startup ecosystem, something that was very much required at the time, probably not required now, because we look around this amazing world in Australia right now, and boy, do we have a sophisticated, inspiring, well-resourced entrepreneurial ecosystem today that it was a desert back then. For example, the entire pool of funds available in venture capital when Pollenizer was founded was smaller than our fund today at Main Sequence.
Wow.
And so that gives you an idea about what we were dealing with. But again, we learned what is the job of making a company? What do you need to be good at? What are the problems that happen a lot for people? We especially learned all the soft stuff. I mean, there's a whole bunch of technical jobs to be done. There's all the lean startup work. There's how you run sprints, how you assemble a technical team, all the practical things that you need to do. But I think there's the soft science of it, which is also very important, which is what inspires people, what worries people, what makes founders have an argument 1 year in and split up, and what was a great idea collapses into a smoldering pile on the floor for all the wrong reasons. And that's just recognizing that making a company is hard. It does need what Seth Godin calls emotional labor to be successful. This is something that big companies and governments, when they innovate, actually don't understand, that emotional labor is a force, is a currency that needs to be activated and deliberately managed in a process. But we learned that at Pollenizer, and it was an incredible learning period. And at the end of that time, we were asked to design the National Science Accelerator Program, which was the On Accelerator for CSIRO. And that's when I first got a sense of the incredible work happening inside the labs of Australian research organizations, and realized how blind I'd be, how I'd been walking down the street kind of ignoring it, how this work was happening in these silos across the country that was not really getting out. And when I spoke to the people making these revolutionary new inventions, I at first didn't understand the language that they were speaking. They were speaking in their own tongue. It was Tower of Babel. And if I had a room with 50 people, all from different scientific disciplines, all working on different companies, they didn't even understand each other because they were talking within their own hyper-specialized world. And they didn't know everything I knew about helping the world around you that can help you when you're starting a startup to understand why it's valuable and want to pull that value out of your company and help you succeed. And so I went on that journey with the On Accelerator program for a few years and really enjoyed it, really felt product market fit, if you like, between what I had honed as a craft over my years as a company builder and then what the science community needed to actually be successful and deliver impact through commercializing its research. And when the opportunity came to join Main Sequence Ventures, which is the CSI Rose Venture Capital Fund, as a partner, I leapt at it all in because there is a huge opportunity to make impact doing that and continuing to do that at scale. And that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years and loving it.
Fantastic. There are so many different threads that I can pull on from that introduction, but I guess just going back to your experience with Pollenizer and with Mick. So I had a chat with Mick in the lead up to this interview as well. And, obviously Pollenizer, I think at the time was probably the first incubator.
It was, yeah.
In Australia. And you mentioned, obviously the volume of companies that you would see and kind of the data points that you would collect from companies would be sort of invaluable in terms of, as you said, what works, what doesn't work, what are kind of some of the common pitfalls that founders at the early stages get. Are you able to share what some of those sort of common traits are for founders who are listening, just to make sure that they're on the right track, or just not making the same mistakes that I guess are very frequent and perhaps avoidable at the start?
Yeah, well, I think it all begins when the pie is sliced. And having that conversation properly. It's not always wrong, but in general, when I see a company that's got two founders in and it's split 50-50, I'd like to understand why that is. And it's not good if that's because it's just too difficult a conversation to have between the two founders. And there's a very healthy conversation that can and should happen at the beginning, which is, well, what's our commitment here? What are each of us going to risk? What amount of labor do we intend to put in? Who's going to carry the different amounts of load? And what happens if it all collapses? And this is really important because it doesn't really matter at the start. At the start, it's just we've got the hubris where we want to make this thing. It's exciting. It's new. We haven't hit any of the roadblocks yet. Our partners at home haven't complained to us that, can you just get a real job and and be around a little bit more. I mean, these are critical things. They're the dark matter of startups, which can be a powerful force to kill it in the future. And so what we're trying to avoid is a point where a year down the track, or sometimes more, 3 years down the track, you've got a partner, you've got a founder with 50% of the company who leaves because they get a job offer and they really just can't handle the ramen salary any longer. And the other founder's left sitting there with 50% of the cap table that can't be put to use, can't raise money, can't bring in another team. Investors start looking at the company going, who's this person with all this equity in the company? And bad vibes are just sown so deeply into the company at that point. So it's having that conversation and having the courage to do it very openly and say, here's what I'm going to do, Rohit. If we're making a company together, here's what I would like to do. And here's my commitment to doing it. And each person having that discussion. And then, of course, you can hold the other person to it as well. It doesn't have this just assumption that we're both going to work hard. And then I think there's just the mechanic of the vesting, just to be very, very clear that it's vested. And that's always I've had so many conversations where, even in the Pollenizer days, Pollenizer's shares in a company were vesting just like everybody else's. And I've had founders come to me saying, Phil, you're distracted with other companies. You're not doing the work. What do you want to do? And it's not an uncomfortable conversation because we know there's a mechanic. We can just turn down the vesting volume. But it also gives the other parties the ability to have that conversation, not just feel very, very angry at home that somebody's getting a free ride here.
Yeah.
So I think that's the big part. I think then in terms of the system of starting a company, I'm still a big believer in lean startup, even though it's gone off the boil a little bit. But I think where we went wrong with lean startup is it became a religion It became a rule book, not a playbook. It became a system of things you must do, which people looked at and went, well, that's just not going to work for me. I think it's a set of principles that put the customer at the heart of something, at the heart of a process that is all about discovery and trying to find value as quickly as possible and measuring your way through that. And then whether you put that on a lean canvas or whether you do 100 interviews a week or whatever that, some of the programs do, that's okay. It doesn't really matter. But as long as you can talk about articulately what your hypothesis is for what you think is true, what you have to believe that this company can be successful, and then you're showing evidence that it's working. Or you're showing evidence that it's not working, so you can come up with a plan B. And I think the biggest mistake people make is they strive for a perfect model, which they have in their mind, and they sort of build that perfect model without really testing it. And I find that is even true today. What's often sort of thrown back is, well, that's not true for my company. My company is a LiDAR company or a synthetic biology company or a quantum computing company. But the companies we have in that space today spend a lot of time with customers testing hypotheses with them. So sure, they may not have a lean canvas, they may not have Post-it notes all over the wall around them, but they have the discipline of customer discovery, and that's really important. I think my new area of focus here around success is I'm thinking a lot about a couple of things. So one is what's the story around a company? How does anybody understand, especially in the world that I'm in now, where a lot of these companies are very, very complicated? How does anybody understand what it is and why it's valuable and what it's here for, what it's here to do? I think, from an investor perspective, this goes very heavily to valuation of a company. We see too many companies which are innately valuable. They're making something impossibly hard that nobody else can make. And if they're successful, it will bring tremendous value to the world. The problem is lots and lots of people need to help them get there, whether they're customers buying it, employees joining the company, investors investing, partners partnering. And people need to know in this noisy world why to join your mission rather than this other mission, even know that there's a mission worth joining. And so I spend a lot of time helping people to understand what that is. And then I think the second part of this is to think in terms of leaps. Leaping is a word that I use a lot with our founders about how you actually architect leaps of value and progress in your work. So, and it matters tremendously in venture capital because we fund companies for periods of time with the hope that the company will be more valuable at the end of that time than at the beginning of that time. And all too often, we as founders grow companies in an organic way. We just try and make the most valuable company that we can, sell as much as we can, make the best product we can, have the most inspired team that we can possibly build. And all this is right. But infrequently do I see a kind of architecture for that. So here's what I'm going to deliberately do to leap up to the next stage of value. And here's all the steps that I'm going to go through over the next few years. And Elon Musk does that very well when he publishes his master plans, right? He says, here are the steps to getting to Mars, or here are the steps to rewiring how energy flows across the Earth, right? He does that really well. So we all understand what our part is, and we know how to look at the state he's at today where the rockets are all crashing. And that's okay, because this is just a stage in the plan. So spend a lot of time talking about that as well.
again, there's so many points that I want to pick up from that. But one of the things that you mentioned was taking a leap, and it's important for a lot of businesses to have the right type of people around you and kind of believing in you, whether that's customers, team members joining, or even investors. I mentioned that I spoke to Mick in the lead up to this interview, and one of the stories that he mentioned was, obviously Spritz, which was one of the most successful kind of companies to come out of Pollenizer. I think Mick was telling me about the story of at the time when you guys decided to back Spritz. I think he had just gone through a failed startup at that time, and
That's right.
And Mick was saying that all of the indicators were this is probably not the right thing to be backing or those sorts of things, but you really saw the hunger behind Dean and kind of the opportunity that was there. Do you want to talk about that from, I guess, your perspective as well as an investor of, what are things that sort of stand out to you or what stood out to you with Dean and with the opportunity with Spritz that made it the right thing for Pollenizer?
Yeah, I mean, ideas always change and people don't, is a sort of one principle that seems to reoccur in my life. And Dean McAvoy is a courageous, unstoppable entrepreneur. Stubborn, you may say, but towards making something awesome that he believes in. When Dean first came into Pollenizer, he had just spent a few years in the US trying to build his Booking Angel business, which was just an online platform for booking restaurants. And he had found it very, very difficult. But he understood the business really well. He had come out of food and beverage. I think his dad owns a pub. And he had, spent lots of time behind the bar in the pub, and his dad had co-funded the business at the beginning. And so, he had a burning platform in the US. He just had to be successful, and he did everything that he could do to be successful. But in the end, these businesses are just walk down the street, try and catch people before service in a restaurant, try and do a deal with them. And Dean had made a great product. He was very successfully selling it, but he was one guy, and he can't walk to every restaurant in the world to scale the business. And he was struggling to find the channel to market, and he was pretty much at the end of his runway in terms of capital. And so he came back to Australia, and we agreed that he would just spend time at Pollenizer, and we'd find some ways of keeping Booking Angel going, and we would spend time together trying to figure out how we might reinvigorate the Booking Angel business. And at the time, Dean had seen the Groupon business growing like a virus in the US. And at the time wasn't thinking about starting a company. He said, wouldn't that be interesting as a channel, as a way to reach our customers and do that at scale without me having to sort of knock on the door? And so we came up with the idea of making that functionality and making an Australian version of it. And we did that in a very particular way that we kind of learned to do in Pollenizer, because we learned that making a company quickly was very important. Like the momentum that you begin a company with is the momentum that the company has in its life. If anything, the companies get slower over time as things get more complicated. So if you started slow, it's just going to go slower. If you start fast, you get people excited, you get things done quickly, you reward yourself with this loop of value. You very quickly, coming back to the lean startup perspective, get resonance back from customers that says, hey, this is worth doing. And so the way we did it with Spritz is we said, all right, we had a Christmas period at Pollenizer, which was always horrible, I've got to tell you. Being a services company at Christmas is the worst thing. And, it's because people all just go on holiday and stop paying you. But what we said in our horrible Christmas time was, let's point the team at what became Spritz. And it's Dean's birthday on February the 1st or something like that. I can't remember exactly which day in February it is. And we will launch the company on that day. That was the commitment that we all made. And we did. And it sold well. It kind of proved that it was working, and things just went crazy from there. We were lucky with the timing. I think we should always acknowledge that timing is important, and our job as founders is to be hyper aware of that timing and try and get ourselves in the same pattern as what's happening in the market around us. Sometimes we can move the market towards us, and sometimes we have to move towards it. But that it was the right time for group buying. It was happening really quick, and so we went to the investor group around us, and we raised some money into the company very, very quickly, like within a month.
Oh, wow.
Very super quick from angels. From that moment, Spritz was unstoppable. And the work that Dean did in collaboration with Pollenizer, I think, is important, because Dean is an incredibly courageous founder that, as I mentioned at the beginning, he's an unstoppable machine. Like, once he's going, he's going. And I can remember there were just a few months in, we were spending $500,000 a month on Google Ads.
Wow.
It's where perhaps other founders may have been cautious, preserving runway, trying to survive until the next round. Dean was very focused on hitting the milestones, proving we're the winner, proving we're the number one in the category in Australia. And that's really important, because then by the time Yahoo started looking around saying, who's the biggest group buying platform in Australia, because we need to buy one, they saw us. And if we'd been second, we wouldn't have been bought. It's as simple as that. And so we were very successful, but we had, we've had some great feedback on that, because it was very good for Pollenizer, because from that idea just before Christmas to selling the company, it was a 12-month period of time, and we sold the company for $40 million to Yahoo. But I've had feedback since then from people just saying, Phil, that was the single worst thing that happened to the startup ecosystem, because for a while there, people had the assumption that should be the norm. That's the norm. You can make tens of millions of dollars return in a year, and investors were looking at it through that lens. And when big companies were looking at setting up startup studios, they were saying, well, hey, a year's happened. Like, why hasn't this spun out yet? So there were some bad things that happened because of it. But I think the combination of having Dean's energy and commitment and conviction with the Pollenizer engine, if you like, that was underneath it at the time, it was good to have both of those things at that time in history.
Absolutely fascinating story with Spritz, and it's kind of one of those things where it was definitely an outlier in the success. But going back to something that we were speaking about earlier in terms of the equity conversations between founders and founders deciding on a 50-50 split, probably being an indicator of potentially not having the right level of conversation as well. So obviously there's all the drawbacks of what happens if a particular founder leaves and they're walking away with 50% of the company. As someone who had 9 co-founders after a startup weekend competition, trying to have the equity conversation is an absolute nightmare. But, one of the key components of that is, can you have, as you mentioned, the right level of conversation to understand what is each person bringing to the business? What does this look like? And having real, open, and honest conversations. And again, speaking to Mick, Pollenizer had an incredible journey, and obviously Spritz was a really big success. But in the end, unfortunately, Pollenizer didn't quite pan out the way that you sort of wanted. And I know that was quite a big sort of story at that time as well. What was that, I guess, getting to the point of sort of realizing that actually we're sort of at the end of the road, or the business model isn't quite working? Because I think a lot of the times, similar for a lot of the founders that you probably worked with, or founders that are potentially listening, is you can go through this period of, not really knowing whether things are quite working or not. And I think I read in an article that you mentioned that there was one specific conversation that you had with someone that you pitched to them a particular product, and they kind of gave you feedback that you weren't really sort of enamored with at that time, but it really kind of opened your eyes. Can you kind of share what that journey was like for you?
Yeah, because I think it's really important, and I would actually put it as strongly as this: that Pollenizer never had a good business model. So when looking critically at what we did, we never had a sustainable model that could consistently be delivered and built upon over time. So I think our revenue kind of peaked at about $3 million a year, and it was a hard plateau. It's like having your head sort of stuck up against the ceiling. You sort of hit that point and you can't go further. And the reason was that it was all about the people. So you had to keep this sort of level resource bench able to deliver the work that had a fixed cost every month. So you had to balance the input of work with what that was costing and how much you're bringing in. And our customers were startups who didn't have much money, and so I often say we had very, very strong problem solution fit in lean startup language, but we never found product market fit where this sort of effortless, sustainable business model started to turn. So over the years we tried, and we knew, by the way, this isn't me saying we were deluded. We knew it was hard, and we were always trying to find a new business model. And we had this idea very, very early on that we performed throughout the life of Pollenizer, which was the end of the line meeting. So you get together and go, should we stop, or do we think we're onto something now? And just have that very, very healthy conversation, which to the dying day of Pollenizer we had, even with the entire team. This was never a founder only secret, in the boardroom discussion. I think it's a very healthy conversation for startups to have, which is can we see it coming? Can we see the evidence that we should keep going for another 6 months and find this, or is it never going to come? And the story that you're describing happened at the end of Pollenizer's life, when I'm trying to remember the two hypotheses we had at the time. Okay, no, I don't remember what they were. So one was we had put in a bid for the management and design of a very, very large accelerator program for a tier 1 Australian company. And at the time we thought, well, we're the best at this. We've done the work. We have a model. We've very honestly put to this big company the way they should think about this, so that it's going to be successful. It's not going to be like your typical sort of innovation theater corporate accelerator program. This one's going to make companies. And we thought, this could be the one where it's sustainable, it's properly paid for. We do the world-class work without sort of scraping around for resources to get it done. And we show that what we've developed over the last 10 years was worth doing. So that was test number one. If we get that deal, we will carry on, right? We did not get that deal. And the reason we did not get that deal is we were too expensive. And it wasn't that expensive. I mean, for this company, it was still a bit of a gift, to be honest, but it was how we could get it done without compromising the work. And we know that the company that did get it got it for half the cost, which would have been an impossible delivery to do. So there was some evidence there that's really important. It was really the perfect market conditions with the perfect customer, the perfect forum in which to play out everything that we'd learned, just the right amount of money to deliver it. Failed. We didn't get it. So that was point number one. The second one, and I will name names on this one because I think David, who's the person that we're talking about, David Burt, who's currently the director of entrepreneurship at UNSW, he at the time was running the On Accelerator program, and the On Accelerator program was going really well, and it was going so well that many universities were coming to Pollenizer saying, could you design and build an accelerator program for us that's similar to the On Accelerator? And so I went to David and said, what do you think, David? Why don't we do it together? Why don't we do CSIRO and Pollenizer collaborating together on a accelerator program which operates at scale across all the universities? And we charge them for it, and we do it commercially, and we do it sustainably. And he said, Phil, I just philosophically believe that all this material should be free. Like, our job should be to get as many people as possible using it, empowered with it, not feeling like they have to pay to use this material. That was the second point. That they were two experiments that we spoke about as a team at Pollenizer that we would run, and the results of those experiments would determine what the future of Pollenizer was. And they both failed. And so the whole company wrapped up, and that's how it ended. But, I'm really proud of how it ended because everybody knew. Everyone worked really hard and just did their best work in the 6 months leading up to the decision. And we all made the decision. It wasn't made in the boardroom, and people weren't surprised and made redundant. And we were able to work with the team to get them onto their next gigs. And I didn't know about the main sequence opportunity at the time. It's something that happened after Pollenizer was closed. But it was the right thing to do. But hopefully what you can see in that story is just how, none of us can just assume our company is going to be successful. And also I think companies have a time and a place where they're particularly valuable, and then maybe the world moves on and doesn't need them anymore. And that's okay as well, because we're all clever people and we can move on to the next thing. We shouldn't stay stuck in something which isn't working.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on a personal level, I went through something very similar with Stage Label, the company that I was referring to earlier, 2.5, 3 years of kind of giving everything to the company, and then sort of realizing, oh crap, the business model isn't quite what we kind of want. Very similar in terms of having a good problem solution fit, but product market fit was really, really challenging. And, coming off the back of that and having so much of your identity tied to what it is that you do and all those sort of things can be really difficult to decouple or kind of move away from. What was that on a personal level? What was that like for you in terms of, making the decision to kind of step out of Pollenizer and then, figuring out what you do next?
Well, I think for me, it would be very hypocritical of me to not be able to hold my head up high when something fails. We'd had you may remember that in the Pollenizer days, Mick had made up a word which was flirning, which became a very important word that we used a lot. And in fact, when I gave a talk at CeBIT describing the demise of Pollenizer, the talk was called Epic Flirn. But this is the idea of learning through failure. Rather than it being a failure, it's just a moment in time where something didn't work as you hoped, but you take an insight from it and you do something with it. And so because we'd gone through that process, I felt reputationally very good. I felt like it was the right decision. And I think if anything, I thought reputationally I didn't want to be in something which didn't have a purpose anymore for myself, as the first, the most important stakeholder in that decision, because I'm very driven by that. It has to matter. And then everything else doesn't matter. Like if the work matters, if I feel like people are valuing it, if the market is valuing it in some way, then I'm, tall and proud. If I feel like I'm flogging something or I'm forcing something, then that's where my reputation starts to feel, first of all, with myself, just starts to feel a bit battered and bruised. And I think that's probably where we would have gone with Pollenizer. Like it wouldn't be remembered for the important work that it did in the time that it was valuable. It would have become that, that beautiful young actor who's now 85, still trying to play those parts that, they don't quite work for anymore. So we all develop through time, and we have to allow ourselves to do that. And I think the other thing that I notice a lot as I move through life is people do become famous for being them, and they always do what they do regardless of where they are. So I'd be interested in your experience actually afterwards, but my assumption is from what I've seen in my own life is that you're doing what you did, the stuff that's uniquely you, your superpowers, the things that people love about working with you are still happening. You've just moved them into another shape. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think once you realize that in life, that your reputation is attached to you most of all. Certainly a company, it starts to attach to you from perhaps work in a company, but it is attached to you, and you can continue to build and work that reputation through time. I think that's very liberating. The other thing I'd say, though, on the other side of that coin is Paul Graham years ago at Y Combinator did a little bit of a study of the Y Combinator companies that have been the most successful, and asked himself, what are the things that are happening consistently with those companies, and one of the insights was that companies where the founders put themselves reputationally on the line very, very early on, make a claim and say, I'm going to do this, and then say, let's go to the market, they're generally the big winners that knock it out of the park, because you kind of, reputation is a powerful currency. It's going back to the emotional labor thing, isn't it? So actually, if there is a way, and we are driven by reputation, we will find a way. And I think that's really important. And I talk a lot about, is it Batman Begins, where the young child has to escape out of the prison that's in the ground. Do you know this story?
I know the story, yeah.
And all the prisoners try and escape because the steps spiraling up out of the prison, and there's a big gap between them. And so the prisoners tie makeshift ropes around themselves and try and make the leap. We're back to leaping again. And they all fall and dangle by the rope. But the person that escaped did not have a rope, right? And it comes back to reputation, isn't it? It's like, I cannot fail. If there's a means to avoid failure, to preserve my reputation and the position I've taken in the market, I will do so. And that's making that leap. And I think it's a powerful enabler. So we have to work it. And I think it comes back again to this idea of acknowledging the soft elements that are often ignored in the innovation process, right? It's how many corporate development, corporate startup programs or corporate VC programs actually think of how is the founder, the leader of this project, reputationally thinking about this, and how do we actually design the whole process so that they're we're maximizing what you can do with that currency.
Yeah. I mean, even I know that I've had quite a few conversations with founders who have spun up ideas that like IP is still technically held with the companies. And oftentimes a lot of those conversations are, you don't have enough equity stake in this to your earlier, going back to the early point that we were talking about, for you to go on to raise additional capital to help scale this. And often that's a limiting thing, and it's not in the best interests of either party to do that. But again, it's kind of short-term focus rather than thinking long-term, what is the best for the people that are actually building this company and what's best for the company itself.
And equity is such a powerful currency, and it has to be treated like the most valuable currency that the company has. I mean, I think the money that people are getting paid is what enables them to be focused, right? It sort of stops them having a side hustle or just getting too much grief at home. They're focused on the company. They've got enough. They can buy their lunch. They can go out for dinner. They can do what they need to do. But equity is the one with massive flex, both up and down. And it's the force that really helps people think through these leaps that I was talking about earlier. That if in the venture world, if you're raising too much money before you've delivered value into the company, then you're diluting, obviously. So if you're not doing the most you can, if you're not deliberately architecting the leap, if you're not landing on the step that you're aiming for, right, so that you're managing your equity, so that after a few rounds you're landing in the place that you want to be, then you're not thinking about it right, in my opinion. And I think, it's another problem you can see in companies when people are actually they don't really think about their ESOP or their equity. They're just thinking about just getting paid and then doing cool work. But actually, if everybody's thinking about how do I maximize my value? So in most of my portfolio companies, in Main Sequence now, everybody has equity in the company, whether you're somebody that mends a machine in a factory or whether you're the CEO of the company. You have the right amount of equity, whatever that means, but it's been thought about. There's a logic behind it. It's been very explicitly spoken to the person about it, so that the whole company is having this conversation about the leaps, not just the founders really hoping they can pull people along. It's actually bringing everyone on the same journey and helping them understand why that matters and what the prize is. If the actual culture of the company is that, wow, the equity, when does that actually turn into anything? Just like, pay me some good money, give me a sales commission if I'm a salesperson. It means people are not really trying to grow the company, or they don't really believe it's going to be successful.
Yeah. And, oftentimes because that equity is not something you can kind of take to the bank straight away, it's kind of really aligning with the people that do decide to join you on this journey. Are they in for the long term? And are they making decisions for the long-term interest versus kind of short-term making commission targets or those sorts of things as well?
Yeah, that's right. And it comes down to belief, doesn't it? So if I say, hey, Rohit, I'd like to give you 10% of my company that'll vest over the next 3 years, and here's where we're going to be in 3 years, you'll be listening to that going, okay, well, do I believe you, Phil? And then if the answer is yes, and if everybody's feeling that way, then we've got a job to do.
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to what we mentioned at the very start of this interview, in terms of your ability to bring the right people along, I was really fascinated to hear the story about how V2 Foods came together. And I spoke to Nick Hazel as well in the lead up to this interview, who's the CEO of the company. But yeah, oftentimes when a lot of VCs talk about, backing companies, they talk about backing great founders, but V2 almost, to my understanding, you identified the problem, you wanted to build a company, and then it was finding the right people to help build that. Again, do you want to share a little bit about that journey and
Yep.
I guess how that everything sort of came together for V2 Foods?
Yes, and it's also an example of how we as individuals continue to do what we've always done, but we do it in a different box. And what we've done with V2, and we're doing a lot now in Main Sequence Ventures, is the Pollenizer playbook, which is how do you deliberately start a company and design from the first day, having all the right people in the right seats doing the right job, so that you're not trying to build the wheel as you're rolling along down the road. So with V2, the story was we knew in Main Sequence that we wanted to get into the alternate protein space. We particularly wanted to start off with the plant-based meat opportunity. And we were looking at companies like Impossible Foods as great examples of what happens when you bring venture capital and the deepest science together, because you can fuel it with lots of money. But at the heart of it, there's this sort of jewel of science that's very difficult, and not many people in the world can do it. If you look at Impossible Foods as a specific case, they took 5 years and $500 million of investor money before the first person got to take a bite out of an Impossible burger. And that gives a sense of the scale of the problem to solve and how hard it is to solve it. And so we asked ourselves, well, how do we design a company that can do that better, in that it can do it faster? It doesn't need to reinvent a whole bunch of things. And for us, that was about a number of different components. So one is who can do the science, of course. So who actually knows how to manipulate proteins so that they start behaving like meat? Who knows how to create flavor systems that transform when you apply heat to whatever this thing is? And all the other things that we've subsequently learned it takes to make meat. Meat is an amazing, heterogeneous, impossible to make product, and it just needs the brightest science brains to do it. So our answer to that question was CSIRO and the work that's happening here in Victoria at the Werribee Food Innovation Centre, where there are just amazing people who have been manipulating proteins for the food industry for years. They didn't have some IP around plant-based meat specifically, but they knew what to do. Right? They just needed a vehicle, which V2 became the vehicle. The second thing we needed was a pathway to market. So we didn't want to then spend years making this product and then start knocking on doors and saying, hey, who wants to buy some plant-based meat? We could see that the market was moving, and it was moving fast. And so that's where we found the relationship with Hungry Jack's and Competitive Foods. Jack Cowan, who's the founder of that, was an investor in Main Sequence Ventures. So that's how we had that relationship to have that discussion. And so they came on board as a founder, and we very much treat these groups as founders. And we can dig into this a little bit, because it's fascinating when you treat an organization like a founder. I think on the Competitive Food side, that wasn't such a big leap, because Jack Cowan is a founder. He's an entrepreneur, one of the best entrepreneurs in the business. So when I talked founder language with him, he completely gets it, always has. Fascinating doing it with CSIRO, which is a big government science agency, and sort of what does that mean to not have a fixed order form for what some research services are going to be? What does it actually mean to be a team who are dedicated to a task, who will get as much done as they can within a time period, and do that to drive up their equity value, right? We're back to that conversation and how the currency of equity. So we brought those two groups together. Obviously, Main Sequence played the role of company formation and the company building, and sort of help people come together as a group, and we continue to do so today, and the initial capital into the company. And then Nick Hazel, who we brought in, and Nick was fascinating because we all said, who do we know that's the best person to lead this company? And we all made our lists. And Nick was on all of our lists because he's got this incredible, unique skill for being a talented food scientist who's made products that we all know and love, Dolmio sauces and various kinds of, snacks for Mars and PepsiCo. And so he understands that world, but he was moving into an entrepreneurial sort of phase of his life. And, he wanted to build something with a mission, especially around climate. So all these forces kind of came together, and I won't pretend that just like magic happens at that point. It doesn't, because of course it's come together. It's been forced together at the beginning, which is where we need the pollinizer era insights to actually feed into that, to not take that for granted and actually take the time to nurture that group and help it coalesce into a company. And that's what we did, and it caused, in V2's case, it was at the point where Impossible Foods was in 5 years, within 9 months. It was a very, very quick development process. It was in the Rebel Whopper at Hungry Jack's 9 months after foundation. And now, a couple of years later, it's exporting all over the world. It's a multi-$100 million valuation company with coming on 100 employees, a massive factory up the road in Wodonga.
Phil, as you mentioned, those things don't necessarily come together easily. And, oftentimes when you're kind of bringing together sort of large stakeholders, especially if the sizes of CSRO, Hungry Jack's and those sorts of things, if they come together and work together well, as did in the case of V2, obviously results in spectacular results. More often than not, though, those things kind of crash and burn and sort of end in tears for the most part. What does that process look like? Or I guess, can you sort of lift the lid on what were some of the playbooks or the lessons that you took from Pollinizer to help bring those pieces together in an effective way?
I think regardless of the kind of founder, whether it's a very large company or a person or a science agency, the principles are the same. Like everybody has to be driven by the equity fundamentally. Everyone has to be focused on growth as a fundamental lever that we're trying to pull, and everyone has to freaking love it, right? And there also needs to be a culture in the group where if it is not working, the right conversation could be had. And that goes to setting that tone very early on. And it also goes to the design of how these things are put together. So one very specific thing that we usually do when we do these big venture science projects, we call it, when we bring all these pieces together to create a new venture, is we give, when there's an industrial founder coming in, like Hungry Jack's is in the case of V2, in most cases, we actually don't expect any dollars for that. That their role is not for money. It's to help. It's to lean in. It's to unlock the company in the market. It's to make sure the first time this company lands, it lands big and it's made a statement and it grows from there. It doesn't have to figure out how to do that. It's already integrated with the supply chain. It's already presenting itself in the right way. It's had the doors open to where it needs to be. If a company is funding a startup, which is usually, let's face it, how we work with big companies. We say, hey, big company, we've got this great idea. We're an early startup. We think it could be amazing if you helped us. Can you invest $1 million into our company? And that starts the conversation of, well, why you? People are pitching us all the time. We'll have to take it to the board. We'll have to get a whole bunch of people to agree with this decision. It's going to be a big process, yada, yada, yada. And this big conversation happens, which usually just terminates. It just runs out of steam, or you kind of shamble your way into actually doing it with the company, but already we're off to a bad start, and the relationships, based on frustration and irritation. If the company is not funding it and the startup is saying, we know this company, our startup does not have the evidence that you need to fund something, but we think we can do that and we'll take all that risk. And we want you to come in. We'd like to give you some equity, which you'll vest like everybody else. And we're going to co-found this company together. It changes the whole power relationship in that it doesn't disempower the big company that might be making the startup more likely to succeed. It actually just levels, it just makes us all founders. It just puts us all in the room. It makes all of our jobs just to help the company be successful. It doesn't give one of us the right to go, but this is my money and actually you're all service providers for me, right? Because that's wrong. That's not going to work. I had an experience recently where we were working with a big company, and it's all very fresh, so I'm not gonna mention any names, but it's a company which we are in general loving working with, and it's going to be very, very powerful for one of our companies. But we were going through just, frankly, irritating things which were just driving the other founders crazy, just all around, just getting the whole thing set up. And I caught myself thinking, but this company's amazing. We've got to protect that. We've got to give them a break, acknowledging that they're a big company and we'll get all this benefit. So just deal with it, Phil. That's kind of what I was thinking to myself. And then the Pollenizer experience and the years of doing this just says, we can't do that. It's sowing a seed of destruction for the future. And it gave me the energy I needed to have the right conversation, and we had the right conversation, and we have very, very strong culture in that company now. So it's kind of, I wish there was a playbook of boxes in a line with arrows going along about here's the steps that you do. So much of it is around empathy for the mess that it is, and courage to have the right conversations, and a belief that the people really matter, and we need to figure out how we unlock them, so that they're doing the most they can possibly do because they believe that's what they ought to do, and it excites them.
Speaking of having the right type of conversation, one of the other things that Nick mentioned to me, which I found really fascinating, was the monthly get-together or Zoom call that you do within specific areas, which is just, to my understanding, all about just bringing really smart people from different kind of domains to talk about specific problems. Again, do you want to kind of lift the lid on what that's like a little bit, and I guess why you first started that as well?
Yeah, I think the strongest currency we have is learning. I call it learning velocity a lot. How can we learn more faster than anybody else? And on the other side of the ledger, I think one of the most damaging things innovators can do is keep secrets and operate on the assumption that there's something existential that can happen because they reveal something about what they're working on, which so far I've never seen happen in my entire career, right? Somebody saying something out loud and then somebody copying it and then it being exactly the same. And so the takeout of that is only good things can happen from my perspective when people collaborate with things. And you can do that in an informal and light way with empathy for the group so that everybody gets something valuable out of it. And we discovered that in Pollenizer. In Pollenizer, it began with, we'd just get all the companies together and we'd have these lessons learned sessions. And so you have to sort of try and synthesize what you've gone through, what your so what is from that, and then share that with the group so that they can benefit from that and hopefully not make a small mistake that you made and go on to be more successful. And we all do that together. Today in Main Sequence, we have the same thing. We have in each of our challenge areas, we bring all the portfolio founders together from that challenge area. And we have a morning call every month called Better Together, where there'll be a theme or an idea, and we chuck that around. And what's been really great is over time we've brought in experts from across the sort of food and agriculture system that may have given a talk to start the conversation and then get everyone noodling the idea. Most of whom haven't left; they keep coming every month. So we have this incredibly rich learning and insights-based forum that happens at least every month for each of those areas. So we get very strong ideas together. Similarly, I had a workshop just last Friday, to give you a very recent example, where a number of our companies are trying to solve for the emerging world of shopping, which is going to be driven by planet friendliness or sustainability. So when people go to Woolworths or they go to Coles and they say, I want to buy my food in an environmentally sustainable way, just like I might think about my own health today, or I might think about recycling today, how's that going to work, right? And obviously one company or person or body can't solve for that because there's a system problem to solve there. It'll be what the label is on the food, what the e-commerce platforms do, what's the categorization of the shelves, what are the pricing differences, what are the politics that's going to stop this, how do you measure carbon, how do you do that so everyone trusts it? And so I thought, well, I'll just get everyone that I know together for the afternoon. And we had people from government, people from CSIRO, people from major retailers, people from major food production organizations like Meat and Livestock Australia, companies like V2, and we just worked on it for the afternoon, and it was absolutely fantastic. But to your point, at the beginning, there was a little bit of discomfort around, we're all kind of competing in some ways, and we're all coming at it from different paths, and we've all got existing projects underway that we don't necessarily want to reveal. But that was fine. We just went from first principles, looked at the customer, looked at the problem to solve, and we all came at it from our own perspective and imagined a future world that we all then left the session a little bit more informed about some other perspectives, especially about how we might do that. My view entirely changed about how to do it because I got all those perspectives. So it's super valuable, and I'm a big believer in that. People should just work together. That's where the value is.
Yeah, and speaking of perspectives, two things that I guess kind of stuck out to me from our conversation today. One is you kind of spoke about the venture science approach of Main Sequence, but you also spoke a lot about the soft skills needed to build a team and build a successful company. How do you sort of find the balance in terms of both, I guess, investing in companies or investing in founders, but also just identifying the right type of opportunities and kind of helping shape those companies as a board member.
Yeah.
What does that look like for you in terms of trying to find that right balance between scientific approach and kind of more of the soft skills?
Yeah, it's. I think another thing that I've learned is to sort of say the word "and" rather than "or" as much as I can. That when people try and answer a question like the one you've just given me, they sort of try and land on one of them rather than the other. And I know that isn't the direction that you're going in, but the job is to kind of move between them and figure out where each of them are important. So I'll sort of explore both sides for a second. So the current chief scientist, Kathy Foley, has a amazing slide that she shows, which is how Wi-Fi happened, which you probably know CSIRO was a major inventor of. And if you go by the various innovation diagrams that we've all drawn, it's like you would think it was step one, organization hired very important person, and then these things happened. But actually, this slide just looks like a vomit of pixels on the page, right? Where there's just this cacophony of people, organizations, forces, collaborations, deals. This just noise of stuff happened, and that, in the end, is how innovation happens and how amazing companies and inventions happen, I believe. And I love that slide, and I just think it tells the story brilliantly. But on the other hand, that doesn't help you do the work, right? If you can't translate that into being more successful than not. You can't translate that into how do I prioritize my first 90 days when I start a company? And that's where playbooks become powerful. And I think doing it mindfully, knowing that you can stray and you can allow some of that noise of innovation to happen, but your starting point is don't think, just execute, and just sort of watch what's happening as you're going through that process. That's very powerful. Also, I find that you can't convince people to do something. So if I'm going to a university and saying, would you like to be the research founder in this amazing new project that we're thinking we might bring together at Main Sequence? And they said, well, how does it work? And I said, well, it's just we just do it. We just get in there and we innovate, and it's messy and it's noisy and it's emotional, but we're really good at it, honestly, and then people just don't really know how to think about it. And so having a playbook, having a framework is extremely helpful for everybody to step into the room with the same kind of expectations about what's just about to happen, for everybody to feel like they're trying to achieve the same outcome. And then the real art is just allowing that to flex when it needs to flex, because that's the right thing for this company to do. And so that's where I kind of go between that balance of things. I find myself on Twitter many days sort of with people espousing a startup principle. We've all done it. And I want to sort of write the opposite, which is true as well. And it's not because I don't believe the statement. I believe the statement, and I believe there's an opposite version of that statement that's right for other companies. So it's kind of, navigating between those is the art.
Absolutely. I feel like I can talk to you all day, and we've gone well over the initial hour that I booked for most interviews. But I guess last question for me, and first of all, congratulations on the new fund for Main Sequence as well, $250 million, which is very, very exciting. And the approach that you kind of spoke about in terms of, looking at identifying kind of particular problems or themes, again, for the benefit of the founders listening at home that are, potentially looking to solve some of these big problems, or want to help and join one of the companies that you have, can you share what are some of the kind of key focus areas for the new fund and how people listening can get involved, or either from being invested by you or kind of joining one of your companies?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. I think one thing I should say is that we've spoken a lot about venture science, but of course we still love just investing in companies that other people have made. And so founders out there with a great deep tech science-driven startup that are looking for capital, looking for help, we are always loving to have those meetings. I think that thematically, we have a number of different challenges that we call them, and sort of how we see our purpose as a fund is that we're at a very important time in history where the planet has some big problems to solve. We're coming out of the pandemic. We've got epic climate change going on, which is going to be non-trivial to fix, but we believe technology can fix it. We've got an aging population. We've got people getting sick. We've got technology going crazy in terms of the capabilities that it puts on humans, but that creates problems and it puts people out of work and all the world is in flux and there's lots of problems to solve, and companies can solve it. And we want massive global companies to emerge out of Australia, be based in Australia, that are going to solve those problems. That's what we see our purpose. And then what we've kind of characterized some challenge areas where we think there are particular challenges for the world to solve, and we're particularly interested in seeing companies that are operating in those spaces. So I work very deeply in one that we call Feeding 10 Billion People, which is all about how on earth are we going to make twice as much food and use half the planet in order to deliver that, and that needs technology to actually make that food. We have a challenge area all around how do we just make humans more powerful. So what are the sensors? What are the technologies? What are quantum computers? How do we keep our technological development underway and not stall? We have one all around humanity scale healthcare. So how do we deliver better healthcare to more people at a lower cost? We have one that's all around how do humans survive. Survive's the wrong word. How do humans cope with technological change? So what are the threats that happen because of various cyber technologies which are attacking our systems? How do we re-educate ourselves? If you're a coal miner in the Hunter, what are the technologies that can help us adapt to technology? If that makes sense. And we have another area all around bridging the gap to space, which is also important because space technology allows us to unlock more value from the Earth. I mean, so much of space technology is not going to Mars. It's looking down on Earth or creating new capabilities for Earth. And the great opportunity for Australia is that is an industry which we can own globally. This does not need to be an America only or a China only industry. We have great capability here. CSIRO's the NASA of the Southern Hemisphere, if you like. And so we have a lot of resources on the ground that we can turn into these new industries. So there's some of the areas that we're really excited about. But you know what? If founders out there with a science-driven idea, which we just haven't even thought of, which can solve a massive problem, we want to hear from them as well.
Fantastic. Phil, absolute pleasure having you on the show. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way, just come over to the website, which is mseq.vc, and all the information is there, and find us on Twitter and join the conversation.
Perfect. I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Once again, Phil, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 149 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with episode 150 of the podcast. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.